Medieval food is one of those subjects that tends to attract people's curiosity. Most have a vague idea of what it was, but what did people actually eat in the Middle Ages? On today's video, we're going to be breaking down everything about medieval food, from the farm to the table. Before we dig in, we have to establish when and where are we talking about. The Middle Ages is a very long period, and medieval Europe is culturally and geographically diverse. So, for the sake of clarity, we are going to be looking at the south of Europe, most specifically to the Iberian Peninsula and at the late Middle Ages, meaning from the 13th century onwards. Let's go right ahead and start with what was available and how to get it. Made out of cereals, the base of the medieval diet was bread. Doesn't matter if we're talking about a noble or a peasant. As such, the production of cereals was the most important activity in medieval agriculture. Many kinds of cereals were available, but the most common was wheat, especially in the southern regions, and rye, which tended to be cultivated in cold and humid areas. In rural areas, families got their annual supply of cereals after the harvest, but only after the separation of the seed, kept away for the next year's crop, and the rent of the land was paid. Since most didn't own their own land, they pay rent by what they produced. The concerns of fundary owners, like nobles and monasteries, was quite different. Their main concern was to collect cereals in form of rent and to store them as fast and efficiently as possible. This was because the surplus of cereals that wasn't consumed was normally sold, and the price varied according to the quality and the preservation of the cereals. In the cities, cereals could also be acquired from the land of those who owned them or could be bought in the market. Another option was to buy bread instead of cereals. Bakeries were a common business, but because bread is a finished product, its price also reflected that. If we're talking about the south of Europe, it's impossible not to refer olive oil and wine. Olive trees and vines were introduced in the Iberian Peninsula even before the Roman occupation. The Romans just optimized their production. Olive oil was the most common fat in the south. The northern part of the territory preferred to use pig's fat. Unlike cereals, which were a constant source of preoccupation and anxiety, the production of wine was very abundant. The problem was to store it. The harvest of wine normally took place around September, which is still a norm today. By November, around the day of St. Martin, the new wine was tasted. In the winter months, wine was abundant, which made its price decrease. But by the end of spring, its quality had diminished abruptly because medieval wine didn't last long in a good state. Nonetheless, it was still consumed because there was no other available. Meat was the third pillar of the medieval diet. Pork was the most popular. Pigs were raised for alimentation only, and it was the type of meat that responded the best to the processes of conservation available. Also, raising a pig was relatively easy both in the cities and the countryside. Sheep and cattle were also available, but the latter was less abundant and normally reserved for helping with farming activities. Cattle was only slaughtered when the animal was too old, and even then it was normally for sale. Chickens, duck and geese were highly appreciated and available, not only for their meat but also for their products like feathers and eggs. Hunt was another form of meat supply. Big game includes species such as deer, fowl deer, bear and wild boar, but regulations prevented common people from hunting these type of animals, which were reserved for landowners. Available for common folk was small game such as rabbits, who could complement the deficient diet of the poorer population. On the countryside, all families raised animals, but the majority was for sale, animal traction or their products. Only on rare and special occasions was an animal sacrifice. The most notorious example of such practice was the slaughter of the pig, which occurred around November and would provide meat for the whole year. In urban areas, raising animals was also very common, depending on one's conditions. Butchers were also present, with a wide range of species and prices. Fish was considered a substitute of meat on abstinence days decreed by the church. Medieval people saw fish as less nutritious and inferior to meat. Fruits and vegetables complemented the medieval diet. Chickpeas, lentils, chips, cabbages, broccoli, onions, lettuce, carrots were highly consumed, as were pears, apples, peaches, walnuts, plums, almonds, figs and chestnuts. Chestnuts could even replace cereals in a year of scarcity. On rural areas, the lady of the house normally had a small vegetable garden near or around the house where she could plant some of these greens. The same can be said about cities, but these vegetable gardens were, in most cases, not completely self-sufficient, so the market was a common practice. That said, it's time to go to the kitchen. For most of the medieval population, there was no differentiation between the place where food was prepared and where it was consumed. Only for the elite there was a clear separation between the kitchen and the space where the meal took place, and only monasteries had a room specifically destined for eating, the monastic dining hall. In noble and wealthier houses, the table was literally laid, hence the expression to lay the table, where the family wished to eat, only to be disassembled until the next meal. In common households, the meal took place in the kitchen. The kitchen was often the only room in the house, and it was used for sleeping and storage as well. Seated around the fire, the family shared food and drink, often drinking from the same cup, resting their bodies after a long day's work. In the most modern houses, food was prepared by the lady of the house, often with the help, at least in minor tasks, by her children, especially girls, preparing them for their future role as wives and mothers. Aristocratic and wealthier kitchens were run by cooks, normally men. In fact, all the cookbooks with known authorship that survive from the period are signed by men. Boiling, grilling, frying, roasting, stewing were the most common methods to cook food. As was referred, bread, wine and meat were the pillars of the medieval diet. So let's have a closer look at these three. Bread was consumed by all, but the type of bread was different according to the social and financial status. White bread was considered the most valuable. It was made with the best sift flour, resulting in a light and softer bread. This kind was only available for the wealthier. The rest of the population had to settle for a darker, thicker bread. This bread was made with a mix of 2 or 3 types of flour, always from the lowest quality. Bread also had a symbolic meaning. Between bread, wine and meat, bread was the only one who had no negative connotations. It was associated with the Last Supper and the body of Christ, a symbol of peace, harmony, and confraternization. Wine was consumed by all, especially if we think that not all water was fit for drinking. Like bread, the quality of wine varied from table to table. The wealthier had access to the best types of wines, while the rest consumed second-rate quality, often mixed with water to make it last. Wine was also connotated with energy, celebration and blood, especially the blood of Christ. On the other hand, wine was also associated with chaos, violence, and as a ticket to a world of sin. And talking about sin, let's talk about meat. Meat was considered the primary source of strength, both physical and moral, particularly important for a warrior society. The absence of meat was a sign of illness or penitence. In fact, the church put a great emphasis on the control of meat consumption, forbidding it on holy days and periods like Lent. These days, called thin days, belonged to fish, available fresh, dried or smoked, and mollusks and crustaceans. So, with all that said, what did people eat on a daily basis and what meals did they have? Medieval people had 2 main meals: dinner, which kinda corresponds to our own lunch, and supper, the equivalent of our modern-day dinner. Since most common people had to work for a living, dinner was normally taken at work, unless their workplace was also their home. Supper was conventionally taken at home by the end of the day. Seated around the fire, which provided warmth and light, the family ate their meal from a platter for liquid or doughy food and a slice of bread if they had any solid one. Wooden spoons and knives were the only cutlery available. For this extract of the population, daily meals were composed mainly of a vegetable broth, sometimes enriched with a piece of bacon, which added more substance and flavor, but sometimes just a slice of bread with an onion skin would do. If we start looking at the upper layers of society, their reality is increasingly different as we go up. The most affluent families had a more varied and rich diet. At the top of the social pyramid was the king and nobility. For this group, food was not only a way of questing hunger, but above all, an instrument for display of power and wealth. There was no shortage at their table. On the contrary, often food was not even consumed, ending up being shared by the servants. As a warrior group, the nobility favored meat. It was abundant, with several types in different confections being served. Bread was of the finest quality. Usually, the meal ended with fruit, fresh or dry, or with sweets, mostly made with honey. Sugar only became more used by the end of the Middle Ages, but it was still an absolute luxury. Accompanying fruit and sweets, wine could also be served, perhaps mixed with sugar or other spices. Spices like pepper or cinnamon were imported from the Orient, making them extremely expensive and only available to some, the perfect way to show off wealth. Having lavish meals was just part of this practice of display. The other one was how the meal was staged and how to behave. Displaying good manners at the dinner table was a way to demonstrate one's level of refinement and education, which consequently translated into its position into the social hierarchy. Medieval rules of behavior at the table had their origins in monasteries, passing slowly to the rest of the society. The basics were to show restraint in relation to food and had an adequate body language. No blunt movements or sudden looks towards other diners or their food, don't molest others, and always show respect towards them. In the lower strata of society, their behavior at the dinner table is practically unknown to us. Their aim was to satisfy hunger as efficiently and quickly as possible, so forget about showing restraint towards food. But on the other hand, don't think that the meal was barbaric. Especially dinner was a time for family reunion and socializing. During long winter nights, people would warm up by the fire, relaxing and telling stories. Harmony and respect for the elders was expected. In the wealthier families, table manners were copied from those of the aristocracy, and it's in this group that the rules of eating are better known. Aristocrats were educated to show off their best behavior. There were even didactic books dedicated to the subject, many in verse to facilitate memorization. One ate with the hands, so the meal always started by washing them. In his writings, King Afonso X of Castile recommended, quote, "Wash the hands before eating, so that they are clean from whatever before they touched, and after eating, they should also be washed so that they are clean when touching the face and eyes." He also recommends to clean them with napkins and not to one's or others' clothes, adding that not washing the hands could change the flavor of food, especially meat, spoil it, or lead it to disease. Diners ate from slices of bread or plates, usually sharing them with a neighbor next to them, which explains the importance of a contained physical behavior. According to banquet descriptions and illuminures of the time, diners sat in long benches, shoulder to shoulder. A sudden gesture of movement would certainly bother the diners around. As said, restraint towards food was mandatory. This means that you should not show eagerness to eat. It could lead to the impression that you were hungry, which was not a dignified behavior. Politeness should be shown by letting others serve themselves first and not choosing the best or the biggest pieces. And in no way you should try to get any food out of your reach. Diners sat according to their position in society. If some food was placed away from you, it was because it was not for you to eat. You should not sit at other people's food or at any food that wasn't served yet. Do not chew with your mouth open or pick your teeth in front of others. Overall, these rules weren't slavishly oppressive. Their existence was just a simple way to conduct an harmonious and pleasurable meal and are still valid for today. On the other hand, just because they existed doesn't mean that they were always followed. Different people in different areas had different levels of education and refinements. Traditions could also vary. But meals and banquets were not just about rules and social representation. They could also be accompanied by music, dances or theater, which made the act of eating even more pleasurable and even fun. Now let me ask you a question. What do you know about Catherine of Braganza? Do you want to know more? Then don't forget to watch my next video. I hope you enjoyed this one, and I'll see you next time.